Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the Johnson edition of the poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 109, By a Flower, By a Letter. Some have read this as another Sam Boyle's poem, that is to say, the quest for recognition and appreciation that Emily seemed to have felt regularly towards Sam Boyles. We've talked about him in previous lectures. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side. Again, Chats with Emily, our playlist. My hope is that you've already been exposed to these set of introductory comments. My hope is that you've worked through the preceding 108 poems. We just finished with poem 108, Surgeons Must Be Very Careful. Now, as we've said a number of times in these conversations, Emily is often, it seems, concerned about her relationships, the acceptance, and at times her desire to please and to be accepted in that act. It is interesting that the biographer Sewell, who we've mentioned a number of times in earlier lectures, will place actually the study of this poem with poems 106, poem 83, and poem 85. Now I will point out as we prepare to read this, just notice all the trinities or the threes of this poem. By a flower, by a letter, by a nimble love, if I wield the rivet faster, final fast above. Never mind my breathless anvil, never mind reprose, never mind the sooty faces tugging at the forge. Now, I find this an interesting poem because it's clear in this poem that Emily is referencing her hard labor, the sooty face, the tugging at the forge, and all of that. The use of the word anvil will be for us a significant word. And when we get to poem 365, in fact, in that poem, both anvil and forge will be used again, which will make that an interesting study for us. Notice we first of all start with three bys and then three nevers, right? Notice, by a flower, and we know that Emily sent Boyle's occasionally flowers. By a letter, we know that she played that game. And then by a nimble love, this use of the word nimble, we will see in poems 112, 8, 13, and 1338. The way that she uses that word nimble as an adjective for love, it complicates exactly what it is she's talking about as she works with that word. If I wield the rivet faster, by the way, this is the only time that wield is used in all of her poetry. The rivet faster, in other words, if I just work harder, final fast, above. In other words, if only I could just work a little bit harder. And then all of a sudden the break in the stanza, and now we're to three never minds. You'll remember in poem 2, when we studied it, never mind faded forests. It's the only other time that phrase never mind gets used in her poetry. Never mind my breathless anvil. Now I mentioned poem 365, and it will be in this poem that she will say, least village has its blacksmith whose anvil's even ring stands symbol for the finer forge that soundless tugs within, refining these impatient oars with hammer and with blaze until the designated light repudiate the forge. So you'll notice that we're playing a similar game here. In other words, for Emily, writing is kind of like working in a factory. It's fascinating the way she plays the game. Never mind my breathless anvil, never mind repose. Now, the way Emily uses the word repose is, in fact, fascinating. We already saw it in poems 27 and 29 and 93, and we'll see it again in poem 110, the very next poem that we studied. You'll also hear it in poems 152, 423, an ultimate repose there, and in poems 718, 942, 943, and then in poems 1068 and 1334. So clearly the idea of repose or relief is central to a whole lot of Emily's stuff. Never mind my breathless anvil, never mind repose, and then of course all these exclamation points, right? Never mind the sooty faces. She'll use sooty one time in all of her poetry, and it's here. Tugging at the forge. Tugging is also only used one time in all our poetry, and it's here. And of course, as we said in our use of forge, 365, poem 365, there it gets used again along with repose. I'm sorry, anvil. My Emily crew, I love the work that they've been doing to help me prepare for these lectures. Point out that tugging at the forge is a whole lot like tugging at the heartstrings. And I think they're onto something in terms of the spirit of this poem. I think at 2A that what Emily's trying to translate is this difficulty, how hard it is to sometimes feel fully appreciated. If only I could just work a little bit harder. Now, I think some of this has to do with the tension that Emily naturally has towards her Christian upbringing, and more particularly that Protestant work ethic that will be so central to the way she thinks about theology and religion. I just have to do a little bit more for God or for the Lord. And in that process of needing to do more, there's the longing to be accepted, the longing for there to be a well done, thou good and faithful servant, of course, the biblical passage. At 2B, I love the trinities of this poem, and to me, often I've noticed that when Emily starts messing around with theological or religious implications, she'll often play with trinities. I think some of that is just the exposure for her to Augustine and Aquinas. I love the word choice. Anvil, of course, as we said. And then 3 words are only used one time, weld and sooty and tugging, only used one time, and it's in this poem. And of course, as we commented, the word repose. At 3A, I'd like to think about Shakespeare's Sonnet 29, deserving this man's art and that man's scope. You'll remember, and we've given that lecture at learnstrong.net. It's fascinating to me that Shakespeare seems to have as well played around with this "am I good enough" question, as I think all great artists probably do. Finally, I'd like to, at 3A, mention our reading of the Bhagavad Gita 2. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. This idea that the work should be enough. And I think Emily danced between these two poles, where on the one hand, the work should be enough, and on the other hand, why is it that somebody like Sam Boyles doesn't get what I'm trying to do, doesn't understand? My face is sooty, I'm working so hard over here. Finally, at 3B, how do we own a poem like this? What was a time that you struggled with feeling fully appreciated, especially because your face was sooty, you were working so hard at the forge, and yet maybe the recognition just wasn't there? It was a time for you when that happened. Thank you.